Hi everyone, how you all going? Everyone's going okay? Good, excellent. Right, so today we've come for the number 2 out of 4 suttas. Okay, who was here for the first session? I'm just getting a sense for most people was here. Okay. So for the first session, we looked at the Bodhisattva's 5 dreams, and this was quite an interesting sutta and quite an unusual one, and dealing with matters of dreams and symbols, which is a bit not quite what we expect from the Pali Canon, perhaps. And now with this second sutta, last sutta was one from the Anguttara Nikaya. This one is one from the Samyutta Nikaya. And Samyutta Nikaya, the collection of linked discourses, where the discourses are collected according to usually topic and sometimes according to a person. Now, this particular sutta is part of the Nidana Samyutta, so part of the linked discourses on dependent origination. And this is called the Kaccanāgotta Sutta. And I'll be reading this from my translation on Sutta Central. And as we go on, I'll take the opportunity to demo a few features of Sutta Central for your enjoyment. But let's begin by simply reading through the sutta. So what we might do is just read through the sutta and then just sit for a few minutes and just have some quiet meditation for a few minutes to let it sink in. And then we can go to discussion. At Savatthi, then Venerable Kaccānagotta went up to the Buddha, bowed, sat down to one side, and said to him, "Sir, they speak of this thing called right view. How is right view defined?" And the Buddha replies, "Kaccana, this world mostly relies on the dual notions of existence and non-existence. But when you truly see the origin of the world with right understanding, you won't have the notion of non-existence regarding the world. And when you truly see the cessation of the world with right understanding, you won't have the notion of existence regarding the world. The world is, for the most part, shackled to attraction, grasping, and insisting. But if, when it comes to this attraction, grasping, mental fixation, insistence, and underlying tendency, you don't get attracted, grasp, and commit to the notion myself, you'll have no doubt or uncertainty that what arises is just suffering arising, and what ceases is just suffering ceasing. Your knowledge about this is independent of others. This is how right view is defined. All exists, this is one extreme. All doesn't exist, this is the second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the realized one teaches by the middle way. Ignorance is a condition for choices. Choices are a condition for consciousness, and so on through the 12 links of dependent origination. That is how this entire mass of suffering originates. When ignorance fades away and ceases with nothing left over, choices cease. When choices cease, consciousness ceases, and so on through the cessation of the 12 links of dependent origination. That is how this entire mass of suffering ceases. So let's just stop for a minute and just sit quietly for about 3 or 4 minutes and just let that sink in. Okay, so now this sutta, even though it's very short, it's a very rich meal of Dhamma. Now, is there anybody here who, when the first time they read this sutta or heard it, thought, "Oh yeah, that makes sense"? Some people nodding at the back. Excellent. Or when you read it, you thought, "Okay, it sounds good, but not quite sure what's going on." Yeah. It's one of those suttas that hints at very profound depths. So I want to take a little bit of time to go through this and just sort of reflect on some of the different aspects of the sutta. Okay, so first of all, I'll just give a brief background to the sutta. The monk who's featured here, Kaccana, is one of the quite well-known monks from the Pali Canon. So he gives a number of different suttas and teachings, and obviously was one of the Buddha's great disciples. So he comes to ask the Buddha this question about right view. Right view, of course, being the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. Yeah? So he's asking that question: how do we define the first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path? Now, when the Buddha answered this question, of course he answered it many times, right? And there's many ways of talking about right view in the suttas. And most of the time when he answered this, he gave a much more straightforward answer. They might say it's, say, understanding the Four Noble Truths, for example, right? But when he's answering Kaccana, he gives a much more elusive answer, much more unique one. Obviously is quite carefully tuned for Kaccana himself, for exactly what he was asking about. So there's presumably some background there that we're not aware of. Now, in the suttas on dependent origination, this framework or this pattern of teaching is fairly common, where it gives two particular points of view and then says these two are the two extremes. And then dependent origination is the middle way that avoids those two extremes. All right, so that kind of overall pattern is fairly straightforward, is fairly common. However, it's usually presented again in a more direct way, a more obvious way. This pair of extremes is like a pair of extremes in theory, as opposed to the more well-known pair of extremes from the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which are the two extremes of practice. All right? So the two extremes of practice is the Majjhima Patipada. The two extremes in theory, or right view, is Majjhena Desana. Okay? When I say it's theory, I don't mean it's purely theoretical. I mean it's got to do with like understanding and the philosophy of Buddhism, rather than with the practice as such. Okay, so the Buddha's taking this framework of the two extremes, the dependent origination which avoids those two extremes, and he's presenting this in a more subtle, more nuanced way than he does normally. Now, so first of all, I'm going to just review what that pattern is all about, why the Buddha tended to look at things in this way. Now, one of the problems I think that it's addressing is that the human mind has a tendency to see things in terms of dichotomies, right? If it's not black, it's white. If it's not day, it's night, and so on. And there's actually other suttas where it talks about this and this specific tendency. And when it comes to religious and spiritual life, then we find that same tendency to dichotomize is always there, right? So some people will say, oh, if you do this, you go to heaven, and you do that, you go to hell, right? Or they'll say, if you have an eternal soul which will live forever in heaven, and others will say, no, you don't have any soul, you're just going to live for this life and you'll die. Right? And so we find that in religious and philosophical circles that there's this tendency for people to sort of split into camps of opposing views. And after a while, those opposing views become quite stuck, and it becomes hard for people in those different camps to even talk to each other. Right? So there's a kind of attachment to views, and this is a problem that the Buddha addressed on a number of occasions. So the Buddha's positioning his teaching as a middle way that avoids those two extremes. Now when he uses this, the word anupagamma, to avoid, has a literal meaning of not going anywhere near it. Okay? So not going anywhere near the two extremes. So it doesn't mean just dodging the bullet, right? It certainly doesn't mean mixing them up and sort of getting a sort of a greyish center, because, you know, I'm too afraid to contradict anybody, so I'll just say, oh yes, I agree with everybody, right? You know, you find a lot of that today, right? You know, in these kinds of debates, you know, you have debates on climate change or creationism and things like that, and then people say, oh, you know, in schools they should teach both sides of the science. You know, actually, there's only the science, right? So there's this kind of idea that the kind of somehow there must be something of value to each of those two sides, but that's just not true. Often one side is simply wrong and doesn't really have any value. So the Buddha's not about, middle way is not about compromising between two extremes. Okay, it's about finding another way. And one of the most important kinds of extremes which the Buddha talked about, which is very commonly discussed in the early suttas, is the difference between what the Buddha called eternalism and annihilationism. And eternalism is the idea that we have an eternal soul which will live forever. Okay? Very popular idea, right? Inside me is a soul. Yay! And then when I die, it'll go to heaven and be happy forever, listening to all that harp music, right? I wish they had a, you know, you might, like after 1,000,000 years, you might be like, oh, I wish they had a bit of bebop occasionally. I mean, the harps are all right for like 1,000 years, but they... Right, so we don't like to think too much exactly what that's like, right? When you start to actually think about what is eternity really, your mind kind of slips off it. You can't really imagine what eternity is like. But anyway, so there's a lot of people who believe that kind of idea. And then there's other kind of idea, which is that we just have this, what the Buddha called annihilationism, which is that we have this body, it's purely material, and when this life comes to an end, that's it, it's squat. Yeah, and as it describes in the suttas, the four elements, your corpse is carried by the corpse bearers and laid down in the charnel ground, and then the earth element returns to earth, the water element returns to water, the air element returns to air, faculties pass over into space, and this person that we call a being ceases to exist. So this is what the Buddha called the annihilationist view. Okay, and these days, again, a very common kind of view, typically coming from a materialist worldview. Now, in this particular sutta, the Buddha doesn't mention the terms annihilationism and eternalism explicitly, but the traditions have always interpreted it in that way, and I think for good reason. So at any case, I don't know that we can. It might be true to say that we can't reduce the two extremes in this sutta to just those two extremes and nothing else. In other words, it might, you know, it certainly has broader philosophical implications, right, than just those two extremes. However, it certainly is an important part of the context to think in terms of those two. So that makes it, when we're looking at it, it gives us something more concrete to think about in terms of understanding what these two extremes are within the context of this particular sutta. Okay. So this is just a little bit of a general introduction. Before we address the text itself, let's have a look at some of the details. Okay, and now here I'm going to show you some of the things, the cool things you can do with Sutta Central. Now here you have 3 buttons there. One gives you information. There's the translation details, translated by me. Yay! Dedicated to the public domain, so you can use it for anything you like. You're encouraged to copy, reproduce, adapt, alter, or other way to make use of this translation in any way you wish. So go for it. Okay, this one here has a bunch of tools and settings and things like that that you can have. And so you can, if you're on Sutta Central, and you can just play around with these and see what they do. This one gives you reference numbers and various other kinds of things like that. So that can be handy. This one is nice and gives us a line by line or side by side view. And this one also is fun because this lets us have a Pali to English lookup. So now we can see the Pali and the English together. That's cool, isn't it? Yes, tell me it's good. Yes. I need your approval. No, and here we have the lookup, so you can just hover your mouse over there and it will tell you the meaning of the Pali words. This is how you impress your friends. Okay. It doesn't get all of them 100%, right? It's an automated tool. Okay, so don't expect it to be 100%, but it's not too bad. Get maybe 85% of words correct. And if you need some more details, you can click on the head word and that will take you to the full definition of the word. Okay, so this is where you can get the even if you don't know Pali exactly, then you can, when you're reading the translation, at least you can sort of check, oh, what does this word stand for, or something like that, and then give you an idea. And sometimes it can help you to understand like why there might be differences in translation. Now this particular sutta is like actually really hard to translate, and I was just checking, I wrote a long essay about this, so we might get a chance to look at that if we get time. But basically it's full of, well, not full of, but certain parts of it have a lot of very knotty linguistic and translation issues. So this is why you'll find that different translators will actually translate it quite differently. Okay, so just coming back to some of the cool things we can do with Sutta Central. From this button here, we can open up the sutta card, and then that will give us various information and things we can do with the suttas. So some reference details up the top here, and then a summary of the suttas, different translations in other languages, so Czech and Indonesian and various other things, root text and parallels, which I'll look at in just one moment. Also up the top here we have an audio button, which is very cool. So if you want to listen to the suttas, then you can click on that, and there you go. Now you can listen to it. I don't know if this is going to, if you're going to hear anything, but so this is in Pali and English. Okay, so I won't put you through the whole thing, but you can listen to it in English and Pali and so on. And we have computer voices for now, but I'm going through and recording them all. So this is one of my day jobs at the moment, recording suttas for Sutta Central, helped by none other than Michael at the back, who's doing all of the tech support for that. So sadhu to Michael. Okay, so so that's some of the details, and then let's have a look at the parallels. All right, can somebody tell me what do we mean when we talk about a parallel for the suttas? Okay. Okay, good. Thank you so much. So yes, the text that we're doing here, the primary text that we're dealing is in the Pali Canon. But of course there are many other Buddhist scriptures outside of the Pali Canon, Chinese, Sanskrit, Tibetan, and the parallels refer to where we have the same sutta in the different canonical traditions. And I'll show you, this is our, so for each sutta on Sutta Central we have a table for parallels. Not every sutta has parallels, but most of them do. And as you can see, this particular sutta has a number of parallels, and I'll explain to you now what this means, what all these are. So the one on the left is our root sutta, giving you the sutta number. These are the parallels on the right. First one is called Establishing Right View, and this is a Chinese sutta in the Samyukta Agama. And that's the reference number there. Now if we click that, we can open that in another window. I was going to open them beforehand, but I thought better to actually just do it here. Open this another window, and here's that sutta. Okay, anybody here speak Chinese? No? No? Yes. Thank you so much. Can you read this for us? Okay, so what you can do is cheat and use our Chinese to English lookup. Shh, don't tell anyone. So, Ru Shi Wu Wen, thus have I heard. You see? Now, this is really how you can impress your friends. At one time, the Buddha is staying, and so this is a transliteration. Nali Ko. So this is like a Julo, so it's a different place, yeah. Profound in a forest grove. Okay. And then Venerable Kaccāna. Anyway, so I won't go through the whole thing there, but you can see, so this is one of the Chinese texts. Fortunately, we actually have a translation. Yay! So a translation by Chung Moon Keat, who's a Buddhist scholar who lives in Australia. And we might refer to this later on. Okay? So that's the first Chinese parallel in the Samyukta Agama. Then we have a second Chinese parallel here, also in the Samyukta Agama. And this one, luckily enough, also has a translation. So this actually is a very popular sutta, so there's lots of translations. So this one by Venerable Analayo. Okay. Now, finally, we have a Sanskrit sutta. And there's the translation, publishing details, and this Sanskrit version also has a translation by Jayarava. So we are lucky to have all these different texts and translations. So we'll refer back to these other versions. Actually, the Sanskrit and Chinese versions are very similar, and they all come from basically the same tradition. So there's a few minor differences between the Sanskrit versions and Chinese versions, but they're basically almost the same. The Pali version's a little bit different. That's the summary of her comparative study. Now, what you can see here is that we have, in fact, two distinct discourses. So one is the Kaccāna Sutta, which is where we're at, and the other one is a discourse to Channa. Okay? And what's going on here is that the discourse to Channa contains a passage where Venerable Ananda is speaking to a monk called Channa, and he teaches him essentially the whole of the Kaccāna Sutta. So even it's actually a distinct occasion, a distinct teaching, but it actually contains almost exactly the same text, or exactly the same text. So that's why it's doubled up. And how you tell that difference is here with these icons. All right? So here at the top we have the icons, and see these are close icons, they're one over each other, and that means a full parallel. Here the icons are separated, and this is a resembling parallel. So that means that they're not quite as close, but they're worth comparing to each other. So these icons will tell you what is the kind of relationship there is between the parallels. All right? And so these are all full parallels because they're parallel between one sutta and the whole of another sutta. This one is a partial parallel because it's a parallel between one bit of this sutta and another passage somewhere else. Okay? And in this case, this is the Pugala Katha of the Kattawattu, And this kind of sutta is called a mention. Sorry, this kind of parallel is called a mention. This happens when one sutta is quoted or referred to in another passage. Okay? And sometimes that's all there is. Sometimes one sutta might just mention it by name, right? As the Buddha said in the Kaccāyana Sutta, something like that, right? But often there's a short quote or short passage as well. And so here in the Kaccānagotta, this is a doctrinal text which is discussing various points of view, and in part of that discussion, one of the debaters refers to the Kaccāyana Sutta and gives a quote from it. Okay, so these are some of the references to the Kaccāyana Sutta. Actually, there are others as well in later texts, but these are the ones we have here. So this is the parallels. So is that clear? Does everyone understand that? What do you think? What kind of inference can we learn from these parallels? Just the existence of these parallels, what does it tell us? Jackie. Right, yeah, that's actually quite an interesting one, because there is some variation in the names, but that's also true that the sutta is actually referred to by name, meaning that it must have come with that name from quite an early time. Yeah, good point. Anything else? There's a common thread between different traditions, yes, of course, and so this sutta is somewhat prominent, right? I mean, there are suttas that have many more parallels than this. This is a kind of a moderate amount. It's not a huge amount, but it does mean that it was a well-known sutta in the traditions. But it also means that the fact that it's mentioned in the Kaccānagotta means that it was a known sort of reference point in the doctrinal and philosophical debates at the time. And this is something that became much more prominent later on, because the Kaccāyana Sutta was the cornerstone, really, of the most famous philosophical treatise in all of Buddhism, which is the Mula Madhyamaka Karika of Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna, living about the 2nd century probably, wrote his very powerful treatise, and one of the most evocative and influential and difficult of philosophical treatises in Buddhism. And the only text that he refers to by name in that treatise is the Kaccāyana Sutta. And in fact, the whole of his treatise in many ways can be seen as drawing out the philosophical implications of the Kaccāyana Sutta. And given that that was the foundation for the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism, the Madhyamaka school of Buddhism is the foundation for Tibetan Buddhism, right? So this sutta is actually extremely influential, directly and indirectly, in modern Buddhism, especially for the Tibetan school. The basic Tibetan philosophical approach of Madhyamaka is ultimately sourced primarily from this particular text. Okay? Questions? All right. Let us continue. Back to the text itself. So the beginning of the text is fairly stock, and there's not much in terms of narrative. We don't know why Kaccānagotta was asking these questions or anything like that. There are many different suttas with this kind of introduction, and when somebody's asking this kind of question, it can either have really it can be for either one of two reasons. The first reason is because they simply want to know the answer, but also it's quite common that it's asked as a rhetorical device, so that they ask it in order to stimulate a discussion or in order to clarify the issue and so on. So again, from the context, it's not entirely clear which is the case here. Reverend Kaccana was regarded as being an arahant. If he was an arahant already, you'd think he'd know the answer to this. What's right view, right? So either this was situated before he became an arahant, or it's afterwards, and then he's asking it for the benefit of the students and to stimulate a discussion. Okay, so how is right view defined? Let's have a look at the text itself, and we'll do like a close reading of some of the key lines in the text. Kaccāna, this world mostly relies on the dual notions of existence and non-existence. Right? Oh my God, this is such a terribly difficult line to translate. Right? Very simple, pretty simple in the Pali. Dvayanisito kwayang kaccāna loko yebuhuyena atitancheva natitancha, but has so many implications already. First thing is to sort of what really is meant by the world here. I mean, the world relies on these dual notions of existence and non-existence. I mean, it seems to mean sort of people at large, right? Seems to be what it's saying, I guess, yeah? They rely on this. And what exactly does it mean when it says you rely on it, yeah? The text doesn't really explain it, but what I think it means is that, like, when we talk about people who have philosophical or contemplative or spiritual views and ideas, right? You know, you rely on that to give you a sense of meaning, yeah? You rely on it to give you some solace, yeah? You rely on it to help make sense of the world, yeah? You rely on it to make you feel less completely insignificant in the howling void of nothingness. Right? Yeah. Right? 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 Maybe, yeah. I think so, yeah. 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 So it's yeah, the people at large. Yeah, people at large tend to fall back on these two ideas. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, the Buddha could get away with that. He was like the Buddha and stuff, so. What do you think? Do they? Right? 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 Yeah. Yeah. And it's still very problematic, isn't it? I mean, it has a lot of implications, right? I mean, it's not just a philosophical issue, right? I mean, you know, all kinds of things like, you know, obvious ethical issues like, say, abortion legislation, right? Is a huge one, you know, and it just gets gridlocked because people have completely opposing philosophical ideas. Yeah. It does, yes, yes. Again, good question. And this is why translation is a funny old business, right? So first of all, Pali doesn't have definite and indefinite articles. So Pali doesn't distinguish between our world and the world, right? But it sometimes uses this as a pronoun that works in a similar way to the, all right? Because it doesn't have a the, so it sometimes uses this instead. Now, normally, when the text would say this world, it's often contrasting this world with the next world, right? And that's quite a common case, but it doesn't seem to be doing that here. Yeah. So I've translated it quite literally as this world mostly relies, but I think you could probably just translate it as the world mostly relies. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Or mix them up, right? Yeah. I mean, I think if you consider, say animals or infants or something like that. I mean, animals are not, you know, cats will argue with each other about many things, but they won't argue with each other about, is there really life after death? Do I get to go to kitty heaven? Right? So these kinds of things are something which emerge at a certain stage of development, right? It takes time to develop that conceptual sophistication. And so here it's saying yebuhuyena, so it mostly lies. So I don't know if we can say sort of absolutely everyone, but it's like a tendency that people tend to fall back onto. Yeah. 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 They would, yeah, but that's more of a kind of a preconceptual thing. That's more like a tendency, but here it is more talking about views. Remember, the topic is what's right view, right? So it's talking about view, which itself is already quite sophisticated. To have a view about what is and what isn't right, and what the world is and what isn't in the world. So of course the underlying impulses and drives and intuitions and habits and so on, then these come at a more fundamental level, and they will tend to shape our views. Yeah, but the topic here is the views themselves. Okay, so it comes up to what the dual notions of existence and non-existence. Attita, nattita. Okay. Now, let's just have a look. Nastitancha, yeah, it's the same. Sanskrit's the same, astita and nastita. So now, to understand what's going on here, we need to take a little bit of a detour into Indian philosophy, okay? Because Indian philosophy took a little bit of a different direction or emphasis than you find that we tend to be conditioned from Western philosophy. In Indian philosophy, there was a strong tendency towards a metaphysical absolutism. That means to say that there's a strong tendency towards an affirmation of reality as being fundamental, absolute, and essential. All right? And this is something that is most commonly known through the Brahmanical tradition, especially the non-dual tradition. Okay? And so and this comes from the very strong theistic roots of that tradition, but also from the immanence of it, the immanence of deity. Right? So just step out of your Buddhist shoes for a moment and step back into the shoes of somebody who's living a few hundred years before the Buddha. Now, in the Abrahamic religions and the Western religions, there tended to be a divorce between the world and the heavens and the sky above. God isn't here, God's up there, and he does stuff and he acts upon this world, right? It's a separation between the world and the deity. Whereas in Indian philosophy, there isn't that kind of separation, right? Yes, there's conceptions of heavens and God's in heaven and things like that, but God is also felt to be immanent. He's part of this world. And this world is felt to be like a manifestation of God, a living, continuous manifestation of God, not something that he created all those years before and now is separate from. Okay. Now, of course, I understand that I'm giving a very simplistic representation of this. We can find these different strands within all of these different traditions, right? These are complex matters, but I'm just giving a generalization. So as a generalization, the Indic tradition often tended to see deity as immanent in the world, right? So this world is divine and is holy because it is a manifestation, a living, actual manifestation of the being of God. Okay? Everything around us, in other words, is God. Yeah? This is the Upanishadic tradition. I am God. Yeah? Tattvanasi. Yeah? Thou art that. Yeah? You, your little self here, think yourself separate from everything else. Actually, you are the divinity that is the cosmos. Yeah? So this is that Brahmanical Upanishadic idea, which is around before the Buddha. And so within that context, there tends to be there's a tendency towards an affirmation of everything. Everything is when we say that something is, it doesn't just mean that it happens to be that way. Right? It is that way absolutely and eternally because it's a manifestation of the absolute and eternal deity. Yeah? And so depending on how you approach that philosophically, then you can say that then actually change is just an illusion. The reality is eternal and permanent and perfect all of the time. And what we perceive as change and things like that, this is just on the surface because we're not seeing clearly enough. Now, within that tradition and within the Upanishadic tradition, there was a strong, there were different approaches to this. And some of the approaches came from affirming everything in the world. And there we have things like the honey discourse. And the honey discourse in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is almost like the exact opposite of the fire discourse in Buddhism. So the Buddha said, the eye is burning, the ear is burning, the nose is burning, all of these kinds of things. Yeah. So in the Upanishad it says the eye is honey, sights are honey. Yeah. The seer who knows those things is honey. Sounds are honey. Ear is honey. Yeah. Everything about the world is sweet. Yeah. Sweet and beautiful. Yeah. Sounds pretty attractive, doesn't it? Yeah. Maybe we should go over to the ashram and follow the Hindus instead. It's a very nice, it's a very beautiful teaching. So this is one of the methods within the Hindu tradition. Another method within the Hindu and the Upanishadic tradition was the method of rejection. And this was followed by a teacher called Yajnavalkya, who famously said, neti, neti, yeah? Not that, not that. Yeah? Neti, neti, whatever you think it is, it's not that. Yourself, you think yourself is your sons, it's not that. You think yourself is your name and your fame, it's not that. You think yourself is all of these things that you've seen and done and heard, and it's not that. Yeah? There is a self, but it's none of those things. It goes beyond all of those things. And it's a separate path, different path to that same basic idea. Everything is rejected except that ultimate reality that everything in the world is absolute and eternal and divine and perfect. Yeah? So this is this tendency, the attita tendency within Indian philosophy. And so when they said that something exists, to say something exists is not merely to say that it happens to be there. Yeah? Or rather it's, you can say that, but when it's in a philosophical context like this, it takes on a more pregnant philosophical implication. To exist is not merely to happen to be. To exist is to be perfect and eternal and absolute. Right? And then the natita, of course, is the rejection of that. Right? Things don't exist. Right? Now, natita is a bit weird, right? I mean, what are you saying? Are you saying things don't exist? I mean, trains seem to exist. I mean, I get on them and they take me where I want to go. It seems to exist, right? This ceiling seems to exist, as far as I can tell. I seem to exist, more or less. So what do you actually mean when you say that natita, that things don't exist, right? Non-existence. Well, this is dealt with a couple of times in the suttas, and we see again from the philosophical background that what non-existence really means, it's not a complete denial of the existence of everything. Yes, it's true that there were certain philosophical schools that evolved an idea that actually everything is just illusion and nothing really exists, okay? But that's not really what this is talking about. It's not the main focus of what's being talked about here. What really means here is that things exist, but they're not permanent. They don't last. They come to an end. In other words, they don't exist in that absolute eternal sense. Right? Attita means they exist absolutely, eternally, and forever. Natita means they don't exist absolutely and eternally forever. All right? Yeah. Now, and then of course this raises a translation problem because that idea doesn't really come across in that translation. So I'm very tempted to add extra words to explain that translation, right? So I'm very tempted to say something like the dual notions of things existing absolutely and things not existing absolutely, or something like that. And I have done that in a few places. In this particular sutta, I haven't done it. So it's kind of something I'm a bit torn as to. But anyway, this is the philosophical background, the dual notions of that we can understand the world as consisting of things that exist absolutely and eternally as a manifestation of a perfect divinity, right? And our change is merely an illusion. Or the other way of seeing the world is that things don't exist absolutely and eternally, and they are just temporal and perishable, and they're just going to disappear. All right? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's a different word. Yeah. Not really, no. No, it's a completely different word. Yeah. Actually, if you look at the Sanskrit, that's even more clear. I can see in the Sanskrit is astita, so it's quite different from atma, which would be the self here. Nastita, anatma. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on that? No, you all good? Shall we maybe just go on, Dana? Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I didn't quite say that. Thank you. Mm. Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's the suttas would call that partial eternalism. And there are other places where it discusses that and looks at those more specific views. Yeah. So this is more like a sort of, I guess, a general philosophical tendency, and then the specific variants that can play out in different ways. But yes, there certainly were. It certainly is possible to believe that. And I think most people do actually believe something like that. And there were schools in ancient India that had that kind of idea as well. Yeah. Right. Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 And then when you're freed from that, then you see, oh, it's actually okay, right? I mean, the senses, Buddha says, burning with greed, hate, and delusion. So if you let go of greed, hate, and delusion, you still have the senses. It's kind of okay, but it's not burning and it's not honey. Yeah. Okay. So I've been talking for a while now. Let's sit meditation for 5 or 10 minutes and just have a bit of let it sink in a bit. Let's continue. Now, we've been talking about these two extremes from a philosophical point of view, but I wanted to point out that as well as being something, our philosophies, our ways of seeing the world are not something that just sort of emerges purely as, just a concept or just an idea, but it comes from who we are as a person, and it's driven by our psychology, our emotions, as much as it is by our thoughts. And these two extremes of the sort of affirmation and negation also tend to sort of correspond to personalities, don't they? Right? I mean, some people are much more kind of embracing. Yes, everything's good, everything's wonderful, everything's sunshine. And then others are a bit more critical, right? What's going on with that? No, hang on. And a bit more suspicious and negative. Yeah? And so these are kind of different character tendencies. When I was staying at Wat Nanachat in Thailand when I was a young monk, and we were visited one time by some, I think it was Sikhs, who were coming the Sikh teacher came to teach the local community, and paid a visit to the monastery and had a chat with the monks when he was there. And we were just talking about meditation and so on. And I remember one exchange, one of the monks who was talking with him was Monk Ajahn Vasudhi. He's a very funny English monk. And at one point, the Sikh teacher was saying, now, if you want to meditate, what you have to do is this. Now, first of all, you have to go to your wife and you enjoy yourself with your wife, and then you come and sit meditation. Okay? And then this monk Vasudhi said, oh, the Buddha talked about like renunciation and so on. And this teacher said, oh, yes, you are right. I am right too. Everyone is right. Right? So this kind of quite beautiful kind of embracing way of looking at things. Right? Actually, there are these different perspectives, and they probably are right from one way or the other, right? But then, another way of looking at it is to have more of a critical approach, to say, well, let's sift out what's right and what's wrong, and then let's move towards a deeper understanding that way. So these two aspects tend to be sort of, I would say, loosely correlated with personality types as well. Not necessarily absolute. I'm not saying that your beliefs are necessarily just determined by your personality. I don't think that's true, but it's certainly influenced by it. Okay, so let's go on with Sutta. When you truly see the origin of the world with right understanding, you won't have the notion of non-existence regarding the world. Okay, loka samudayang. When you truly see the origin of the world with right understanding, you won't have the notion of non-existence regarding the world. Now, when it talks about the origin of the world, from a general point of view, then you can say, well, it's looking at how things come to be, right? So you won't your mind's not going to be focused on, you're not going to be attached to the idea that nothing exists, or remember that the idea that everything just disappears, because you're actually watching things come to be, right? Loka samudayang. But loka samudayang, the origin of the world, has a more specific meaning in Buddhism, because of course samudaya is the second noble truth, right? The origin of suffering, or aka the origin of the world, right? So loka samudayang is also talking about the creation of the world from our desires and attachments, right? And this is where it comes into dependent origination, because dependent origination, which is what Sutra is leading up to, of course, talks about that in more detail, how this world that we know and we see is conditioned and produced because of our desires and attachments. And so when you see that, then you realize that it's not true to say that everything that we see here is just going to disappear, because you've seen that in your mind there are these creative forces, these desires, these attachments, and these make worlds. This is what the origin of the world is, yeah? Coming from inside ourselves. And when you truly see the cessation of the world with right understanding, you won't have the notion of existence regarding the world. Okay, so again, on a general point of view, you can say what this means is that again, if we think of existence as being eternal, permanent, absolute existence, if you see things ceasing, stopping, then you're undoing that attachment to that idea of eternal existence. Yeah? But again, from a Buddhist point of view, loka nirodhang is the third noble truth, which is nibbana, ultimately. Yeah? The letting go of suffering. So when you see that cessation is bliss, then you won't have this idea of eternalism regarding the world. Okay? Yeah. At this point, pretty much. Yeah. Although, again, this is a technical term, right? In the suttas, when it has this phrase yatha bhutang, right? So when you truly, which I've translated here as when you truly, okay, samapanyaya, you truly see the origin of the world, that usually means a stream enterer. Yeah, stream enterer. So the first stage of enlightenment. Yeah. So when you've got the real stuff. Yeah? So that's not to say that this, that's to say that's when this knowledge is really perfected. And again, just to come back to the asking of the question is what is right view? Right view is what is achieved by a stream enterer. Right? So a stream enterer, one of the first of the 4 stages of enlightenment, has right view. Until then, we're struggling, a bit of right, bit of wrong, mix it up, try to do our best, but a stream enterer has a right view. Okay? So, yeah. Yeah. Right, yeah. In this context, it has a very similar meaning. Yeah, the loka and the all has a very similar meaning. It doesn't just mean the sort of the external physical cosmos is going to end, although obviously it is. But again, these are terms from that Upanishadic background. Right? They talks about the sarva and the loka, and pretty much interchangeable. Yeah. In this philosophical sense. Yeah. Right? Yep. Yep. Yeah. It's a pattern, yeah? Yeah, it's quite subtle, yeah, when you look at it. And so this is also giving you instructions for your meditation, right? If your tendency is one or other of these tendencies, then it's giving you an antidote for that, right? So this is when people, if you're like, actually I really think I'm going to keep on existing, right? I really believe that there's something more. Okay, that's fine. Just do some meditation on cessation. See what happens. Yeah? Or if you don't believe in future lives, rebirth and things like that, that's okay. There's no point in arguing with people about this. I can't prove to you that there's such a thing as rebirth. Right? I mean, I can point to some evidence if you want to discuss it and so on, but if you don't believe it, that's okay. But have a look in your mind at the origin of things. Look at the way that you build worlds in your mind through the creative power of your own cravings and attachments. Right? And you see that actually these cravings are manifesting the world that you're living in. And then you look and say, oh, okay, this is what the Buddha's talking about with the creation of the world. Right? And so then that's sort of starting to give you a new perspective to move beyond those points of view. Okay, so the world is for the most part shackled to attraction, grasping, and insisting. Now, upayupadana abhinivesa vinibandho kvayang Kaccāna loko yebu yena. So it might come as a surprise to you, but this particular phrase here is a little bit difficult to pass out. Okay, it's a compound with a bunch of different terms in there, and if I get time I might come back and look at it in a little bit more detail, but I will just note for now that when we have compounds in Pali, that there are a number of different ways of forming compounds in Pali, as indeed there are in English, and it's not always intuitively obvious what the meaning or what the relationship of the words in that compound are. In this particular case, there's also some variance in the spelling, variant readings, so that adds to the confusion a little bit. So I've translated it, the world is for the most part shackled to attraction, grasping and insisting. Okay, now I won't discuss these terms exactly yet, but I'll come on to the next sentence which repeats some of the same ideas. But if, when it comes to this attraction, grasping, mental fixation, insistence and underlying tendency, you don't get attracted, grasp and commit to the notion myself, you'll have no doubt or uncertainty that what arises is just suffering arising and what ceases is just suffering ceasing. Your knowledge about this is independent of others. All right, now this is a complex sentence and one of the hardest sentences in the whole Pali Canon to translate, and one of the problems, one of the many problems here is this little thing here, tanchayang, because there's a compound, tang means that. So first of all, what is that referring to is unclear. Ayang, the ch can either stand for and, or it can stand for if. Right? So cha is and, che is if. Most Pali translators have translated it as if it was as if it was and, but if we look at, I think, in the Sanskrit, am I correct? All right, yeah, so in the Sanskrit, we have che, if. So given that the Pali is ambiguous and that the Sanskrit says if, then I translated it as if rather than and, which is, I think, different from most other translators. So if you find other translators differing from it, then this is why. And I think this makes more sense in the context. Now, when it has this long lists of all of these different things, these different forms of attachment, okay, I believe that we can discern a kind of progress in here. Often in Pali, we will have like a list of terms that are just synonyms, all right? So it'll say you make an effort and try and commit yourself and put forth energy and so on, and it's just synonyms, and we don't want to read too much into it. And the reason the synonyms are put there is essentially to preserve the information, because it means that if you lose one word or get one garbled or something like that, you still have the meaning of the sentence the same, right? So be careful about over-reading and over-interpreting into sentences where they have a lot of synonyms, right? However, in this particular case, I believe that there's something more to it. I believe that these are not just a list of synonyms, but there's actually a sense of progress in what's going on, right? Attraction, the upaya means like catching its eye or drawing near to something. Upadana is picking it up. Yeah? Upadana, grasping on it. Chetaso adithanang is mental fixation, right? The aditthana is to resolve or to fix, to fixate the heart. Yeah? Abhinivesa is a word meaning to insist upon something. Right? So when you insist upon it, means like only this is right. It must be like this. Yeah? And then the anusayang is where it becomes an underlying tendency. It becomes so habitual. It's like part of who you are, and you don't even see it or know it anymore. Yeah. So this, to me, this is like expressing a psychological pattern, right? And this is very much like Gollum. That's what you were thinking, wasn't it? Right? What's that? So shiny. Yeah. Oh, it's so beautiful. You pick it up. My precious. You hold on to it, and you have to have it. You'll even murder for it. Yeah? Yeah? My precious. And then once you've held on to it for so long, it changes who you are. Yeah? He's no longer who he was. He's no longer Smeagol. Yeah? Now he is Gollum. Yeah? This is the Anusaya. He's become a completely different person because of his attachment to that ring. So this, I think, that kind of idea is being expressed here in all of these terms. Yeah? And this last part of the sentence is quite, again, very, very difficult to translate because of different readings and lack of clarity in the meaning and things like that. But I think the meaning is as I've translated it here. I did a lot of research for this. You don't get attracted, grasp, and commit to the notion myself. Na upeti, na upadiyati, na dhyati, atta nameti. I think this has a missing na in it. I think there's a variant reading or something like that. What does it say? Na upeti to the notion myself. You don't get attracted. Na. Oh no, there's no missing na. Atta nameti. That's right. In some variants, there's a na in there. Let's see if there's variant readings here. Oh no, I won't bother. So in some variants, there's a na there. Anyway, look, I won't go into all the details because it's too boring and Pali geeky. If anybody wants to ask me about that, the Pali, we can discuss it later on. Anyway, the point is that this is expressing at the end of that process of attraction, fixating, and so on, then you will grasp onto it as myself. Yeah? Because of that shackling. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. It is, yeah. It is. It's third person, and when I'm translating, I sometimes use the impersonal second person. Right? So it's not directly referring to you as in you, this person, but just when this happens to, and and you do this, it's a common idiom in English that you is used in that impersonal sense. And the reason I do that is because the alternative is to say one, which is very formal and distancing. Yeah, so one doesn't become attracted, grasp and commit. So I try to use a more colloquial expression. Yeah. Right? Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's coming back to that experience, and that's how you see it, right? You see that process coming alive in your meditation. Yeah. And then yeah, this is where your self comes out of it. You realize you're actually building up your sense of self by reinforcing these patterns. And when you can let go of it, your sense of self is starting to dissolve. This is one of the things which is actually really, I think, really hopeful and really positive about Buddha's teachings, because if we think about the self, right, the atta, it's such a big thing. It's so fundamental. How can we possibly think what really is not self? How can we even get our minds around that kind of concept? And so the Buddha's breaking it down in terms of a process that's happening in your mind in meditation. Don't worry about completely getting rid of your sense of self and understanding it all in every way, but just look now at how those thoughts are fueled by feelings and leading to ideas and then reinforcing each other. And look what happens when you don't do that. And every time you don't do that, it starts to cease, starts to unwind. Yeah. So if you're not getting attracted, grasping, getting fixated, you don't get attracted, grasp and commit to the notion myself, and you'll have no doubt or uncertainty this again is these are technical terms that convey a specific meaning. Having no doubt or uncertainty again is referring to stream entry. And what the Buddha is describing here specifically is the realization of somebody who's becoming a stream enterer. And that's quite explicit here when it says aparapacchaya jnanameva sa etahoti. Right? Your knowledge about this is independent of others. Right? That's specifically only a stream enterer. Before stream entry, our knowledge is partly from our own inner understanding, yoniso manasikara, partly from things we've learned from others, the paratogosa. Yeah? But for the stream enterer, they know and see it for themselves. Right? And this is one of the defining characteristics of a stream enterer, aparapacchaya, not dependent on others. And to me, that's one of the beautiful things about Buddhism and the path of Dhamma. Yeah? It's not a path to becoming dependent, it's a path to becoming independent. Right? So the Buddha said, yes, we support each other, right? We help each other, we teach, we learn, we study, we discuss, all of these kinds of things, but our goal is to not make you more dependent. Our goal is to make you independent. Yeah? So this is one of the things that I always try to do as a teacher. This is why when I'm teaching Dhamma, I try not to give you things that are too pre-digested. Right? Actually, it's really quite easy to do that kind of thing. I could just make a little summary and say, this is what sutta means, 1, 2, 3, 4, there you go, and you just go off and say, no, now I know that sutta. Yeah? It's easy to do these pre-digested things, but the problem is that then you're then always dependent on the teacher to digest things for you, right? So I want to give you the ingredients so that you learn how to cook. Maybe a bit longer, a bit slower, right? But at the end of the day, you can make those nice organic vegan meals for yourself. Yeah? And wherever you go, you can do that. Yeah? So that independence. And so this beautiful phrase, dukkhameva upajjamanang upajjati. Yeah? Suffering, what arises is just suffering arising. What ceases is just suffering ceasing. And it's just such a powerful reflection. Yeah. I've looked at this thing where you look at arising and ceasing, look at what's, the world has been created through our thoughts and desires and attachments and feelings, and we're constantly in the cycle of creating the world, or we're letting go and the world's coming to an end. But actually all of that is just dukkha. When it's arising, it's just dukkha arising. It's ceasing, it's just dukkha ceasing. Why are you afraid of it? Why are you worried about it? Why do we get so involved in it? It's just dukkha. Yeah. So this is how right view is defined. And the Buddha goes on. All exists. This is one extreme. All doesn't exist. This is the second extreme. Avoiding these two extremes, the realized one teaches by the middle way. Now, I believe, and let me just double check this. Right. In the Sanskrit version, these particular lines are not there. So the bit about the middle way just follows on straight from this part. Right? So I think it says astita nanati. Yeah. And these particular lines are a little bit controversial, and the reason that they're controversial is because the phrase sabbamati is exactly the name of one of the schools of Buddhism which was prevalent in later years. Which we usually know by the Sanskrit form is Sarvastivada, in Pali is Sabbativada. And so it's literally the school whose core doctrine was that all exists, right? The Sarvastivada school. And in fact, the other versions of the Kaccāyana Sutta that we have by one of those accidents of history, all stem from the Sarvastivada school. Okay? And they lack that statement. Okay? So the Buddha appears to be saying, your school is teaching an extreme view, and they don't have that. So then the question comes, well, it seems a bit suspicious, doesn't it, right? So is it that the Theravadins added this to the Pali in order to make the Sarvastivadins look bad? Or did the Sarvastivadins take it out? Who knows, really? Could be either, yeah? But this is a fairly rare occurrence in the suttas. It's quite, like when we look at the parallels, it's quite common that there might be small differences from one parallel to the other, right? But it's rare to find that those differences are actually driven by some kind of doctrinal imperative. It's usually just a difference in wording, the sequences are organized a bit differently, or these kinds of minor differences. There's very few occasions where it really looks like there's a sectarian difference between one text and the other. But in this particular case, it does look like a sectarian text, sectarian difference. And it's probably the case that either this passage is added or it's taken away. Do I have an opinion on that? I can't remember. I can't remember if I've researched that particular point. Sorry, Anders, you're going to say? You sure? It's either been. It doesn't have to be, but seems likely, right? It could be by accident, but then it's just a bit of a coincidence. Yeah, just happens to be that line that specifically mentions the name of one of the schools of Buddhism. That's right. Yeah, most of the Chinese sutta translations are from the Sarvasivadan texts. Not all of them are, but all of these ones are. All of the parallels for the Kaccāna Sutta are, yeah. The Tibetans also, yeah. Tibetan texts are mostly derived from the Sarvasivadan school. Sarvasivadan school was very dominant in the north of India. So geographically, it was the kind of Buddhism which was dominant that got taken to Tibet, but also was taken to China via the Silk Road. So not all of the Chinese texts are from Sarvastivada, but a lot of them are. And a lot of the Sanskritic texts are as well. So it's a bit unfortunate because we have a lot of Sarvasivadan texts, but we have very few from many of the other schools of Buddhism. So the Gandhari texts, they don't have a parallel for this particular sutta, but they do have some parallels for it. There's only a few, right? So I can't remember how many, maybe a few dozen Gandhari suttas and fragments. So there's Dhammapada texts, and there's a few Anguttara and other sutta style texts. Yeah, but they're from a different school. They're from the Dharmaguptaka school. Yeah. Okay. Any more questions on that? No? Yes. Well, is the Pali text older than the Sanskrit parallel? Difficult to say. Difficult to say. As a rule, yes. As a rule. Now, when I say as a rule, I mean as something to be broken frequently and gleefully. Okay? Is it more correct? Oh my goodness. Oh, well, who can say? What I can say is that I think that if you look at both of them together, then you can often get a better idea than you would have done if you look at one of them by itself. Right? But on the whole, on average, you tend to find that the Pali looks like it's probably a bit earlier. Right? But most of those differences are really just like decorations in the text. Like the Sanskrit might add a few extra words, a bit of extra phrasing and these kinds of things. It might be kind of expanding it out or adding a bit of extra explanation for things that are a bit uncertain and so on. But it's not like, it's rare that you find it actually trying to teach a different doctrine. Like a different doctrine might emerge out of more or less by accident, right? And I'll give you an example of that. In the Pali Suttas, we very commonly find it mentions anicca, dukkha, anatta, right? Impermanent, suffering, and not self. Yeah, constantly we find this hundreds of times, anicca, dukkha, anatta. Now, in the Sarvastivadin texts, it usually has anicca, dukkha, anatta, sunyata, right? Usually. Now, there's nothing kind of doctrinally problematic about that from a Pali point of view. I mean, Pali texts talk about sunyata. It's fine. There's sunyata suttas in Pali. There's plenty of places where it's talked about, but it's not quite emphasized in the same way, right? So you can imagine from an editor's point of view, they might be like, well, it's okay. You can put sunyata in there. Was sunyata in there or not? Well, not quite sure, but it's all right. It's not going to really change the meaning of it, right? And it doesn't actually. However, it does shift the emphasis a little bit, so that sunyata becomes a more important concept, and so the philosophical schools that draw from that tend to emphasize emptiness more than perhaps the Pali school does. Yeah? Again, it's not necessarily a difference in a contradiction, but a difference in emphasis. And that's even the case in dependent origination. In Nagarjuna, see if I can actually find the passage. See, Nagarjuna talks about dependent origination a lot. Not sure if I can find the exact passage that I'm looking for. I think it might be this one, actually. Okay, so I'll just talk a little bit about Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna, as I mentioned before, drew on the Kaccānagotta for his main thesis, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And the Mula Madhyamaka Karika essentially extends the argument of the Kaccānagotta about existence and non-existence, and applies that in a devastating philosophical critique especially aimed at the Abhidharma schools who existed at the time, primarily being the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma schools. Okay? Whether that philosophical critique equally applies to the Pali Abhidharma is probably, but he wasn't directly answering to the Theravadins, because he was up in the north of India, right? So he was talking to the people who were around him, not the people in Sri Lanka. So anyway, here he says, ya pratitya samutpada, ya pratitya samutpada sunyatang tang prakshame. I'm not exactly sure how to translate that, but here he's talking about what is dependent origination is emptiness. Yeah? That is prajakshame. I'm not sure. I think that is what is seen or something like that. I'm not exactly sure what that last word is. In any case, the point here is that he's talking about dependent origination in terms of emptiness. And this is something that he does quite a few times through the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. Actually, that is something that's not found in the Pali Canon. Okay? We don't find suttas in the Pali Canon that directly correlate dependent origination with emptiness. Right? Now, of course, you can infer that, right? But it's not directly stated. However, in the Sanskrit Agamas, we do find that. In the Sanskrit Agamas, it says that that emptiness is a term for dependent origination. And again, this is a very, very very important idea in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. We find this a lot, the explaining emptiness in terms of dependent origination. So this is an idea which comes from an Agama Sutta, which has a slightly different wording than we find in the Pali. And then Nagarjuna picked up on that wording and then, drew that out and emphasized that. And so again, it just shows how sometimes those differences between the Buddhist schools can stem from what might be just a small difference in the early text. And while we're on Nagarjuna, I'll just show you here. This is the line in Nagarjuna where he's quoting the Kaccāna Sutta. So the Katyayana Vavade and Chasti di Nasti di Jobayang. So in the discourse to Kaccāna, the pair of existence and non-existence. So clearly he's talking about the same thing, right? It's not just something that has the same name. It's obviously talking about the same text. Pratisiddhang. I'm not sure if Pratisiddhang is my Sanskrit isn't that good. Pratisiddhang means sorry? Of that particular verse? 15.7? Go on. Right. Yep. Okay, good. Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. Yeah. Okay, so again, just to sort of emphasize how powerful and how important this particular discourse was. And I think the reason for that is, there are many powerful and many profound discourses in the Pali Canon, but this is one that's very suggestive. And I think it's very fertile in that I think it has a very powerful and kind of defined, clear meaning. Right? The actual explicit and definitive meaning of it is very powerful. Right? Talking about how to observe the origination and cessation, to be able to let go of those things and to see that those things are just suffering arising and suffering ceasing. So in that respect, just the kind of the literal and the basic meaning of the teaching is already very powerful and very profound. But it's also a teaching that's very suggestive and which invites philosophical contemplation and application in different kinds of spheres. And so I think this is one of the reasons why it's exerted a lot of fascination on people's minds from that time until today. Okay, so we've been sitting for a while now, so why don't we take a bit of a break and have a cup of tea and so on, and then we'll come back to a bit later on. Right? Does that sound like a good idea? Okay, let us do that.